Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. And this week it's just going to be me and you guys talking about why supply chain visibility remains an elusive goal for many companies. This has been a question I've been noodling on for quite some time, and I thought it'd be a good topic of conversation. And like I say every week, this is a great opportunity for you joining us today to contribute your thoughts and your questions to the topic. If you are joining us as a guest, just a reminder that you do have to register first in order to be able to ask a question. So let's talk about visibility. I mean, I've been in this industry now for 15 plus years. I've done a lot of surveys myself. I've looked at many surveys that third parties do of supply chain executives, and year in and year out, by far the number one challenge or issue that supply chain executives have is gaining supply chain visibility, timely, accurate, and complete supply chain visibility. If it's not number one in a survey, it's number two or number three. It's always in the top three. And why is it that after all this time, companies are still struggling with gaining supply chain visibility? If you look back at the late 90s, early 2000s, I mean, there was a whole class of software that emerged called supply chain visibility and event management. And this was probably one of the hottest, segments of the software market, over a decade ago. A lot of companies were implementing these solutions. There was a lot of buzz about them. Just like today, you hear a lot of the software vendors talking about omni-channel and BI. Back then it was all about visibility, and event management. But despite all that investment in that type of software, and ultimately a lot of those standalone applications went away because those capabilities, visibility and event management, ultimately got embedded within other supply chain applications. So if you got a TMS, a transportation management system, it had visibility and event management capabilities. If you had a WMS, it also started to have visibility and event management capabilities. So it became kind of a feature or capability that was found in other applications. But again, despite all those investments in technology, in software, certainly if you look over the years, you've seen things like RFID and GPS, wireless technologies that all arguably could make visibility easier to achieve, and they have, but it's still a challenge. And the reason is, at a high level, I'm going to go through a few of the challenges, about 5 challenges that I see. But if you look at it at a high level, really it's about 2 things. Number one is that it goes beyond software, right? There is no magic bullet software application that you could put in there. So while you can, my point of view is that actually the software is not rocket science. You can. It's really about bringing data together and kind of formatting it and creating milestones and being able to if certain events aren't completed by a certain time, send an email to someone. That's kind of the gist of these applications. So it's not rocket science. The hard part is actually the connectivity piece is one piece of it. So it's beyond software. There's connectivity involved, right? How do you bring that data, that information into the systems to begin with? And that's where a lot of companies continue to struggle. There's process involved in terms of making sure that data gets captured, in terms of the quality is up to your specifications, and there's people involved. People are involved in this process as well to capture the information, execute the processes that you've put in place around data quality management to execute those efficiently and in a timely manner. So again, it goes beyond software. There's connectivity, there's processes involved, and there's people involved. And the second thing is that you have to continuously work at it. This is not a we've implemented the solution and you're done. I mean, you really have to make investments in time, in money, and in resources to make sure that the data that you're getting is of high quality, that you're getting it in a timely manner, and so on and so forth. So I'm gonna talk about some of the challenges related, to those 2 topics. But but again, I think that the bottom line is, and I think the recognition is that this really goes beyond software, and it's not easy, and it's something that you have to keep working on, and someone has to take ownership of it in order for you to achieve your goals around supply chain visibility. So let me talk about some of the challenges, and again, this is by no means a comprehensive list, but this is the things that I see that are kind of some of the main challenges or roadblocks out there for companies, with regards to gaining timely, accurate, and complete supply chain visibility. So the first one is, and again, this is not a surprise to anyone, is that there are too many systems in too many places, in too many formats, across many companies and across many geographies. So one challenge is just integrating into all these different applications, and of course these different applications, they're some of them might be client server applications, some of them might be proprietary applications developed 10, 20, 30 years ago. So really a real challenge on the integration front in terms of connecting with the variety of systems that are out there. The other thing is, in terms of formats, everyone has different formats in terms of how they capture data, how they represent it in their database. The way times are recorded, the way dates are recorded, the way geographies and countries are recorded. I call a product XYZ, you call it ABC. So trying to harmonize all this information is another challenge, right? So it's not just the integration piece, but it's also the harmonization piece, because even once you get connected to all these systems, the way the data and the information is stored in those applications varies by company, varies by application, varies by geography, might be in different languages, again, different date formats, so on and so forth. So that is one of the key challenges there. Integrating to the different applications that have the data and the information you need, and then harmonizing, making sense of all that information, so that you're able to do apples to apples, comparisons. The second challenge is, a lot of the data and information is, communicated in batch or serial format, right? So you see, this is, part of EDI in many ways, where, information, even though we talk about real-time visibility or near real-time visibility, in a lot of cases, the systems that you're dealing with work in batch mode. So they may capture a lot of information and they may not send it along or transmit it until 4 hours later or 8 hours later, or maybe it's once a day. And then to compound the issue, if you've got a sub-supplier, they're kind of batching that information, sending it along to someone upstream. They're putting it into their system. That system is also batch-oriented, and they may not process and transmit that information for 2, 4, 6, 8, 12, 24 hours. That gets transmitted upstream. So by the time you get the information, at best, it's a few hours old, and at worst, it could be a few days old. And that's just the reality of the way some of these systems work today. Now, obviously, you may not need every type of information in a real-time basis. Getting it in a batch mode or every few hours or every few days might be okay for perhaps a vast majority of the data that you need. But it's kind of sifting through the data that you actually need on a more real-time and timely basis, from these batch systems. And how do you get that how do you get visibility to that in a more timely basis? That's part of the challenge. And again, trying to be able to then move away from the serial communication of data and information to a more parallel or simultaneous communication of data and information, where everyone that needs to know a particular data point, whether it's the amount of supply on hand, the status of a shipment, whatever the case might be, gets access to that information simultaneously in a timely manner as possible. But again, that's not happening across the board these days. I think you still see a lot of batch-oriented communication, which is kind of inherent in a lot of the EDI systems out there, and you see a lot of serial level communication. The third challenge is the reality that low-tech, no-tech processes still exist. in some ways we're kind of spoiled here in the U.S. and certainly some of the Western European countries where, internet connectivity is almost ubiquitous these days. Wireless connectivity is almost ubiquitous these days. Um, but I think it's you have to recognize that that's not the reality in many parts of the world. We may be spoiled that you may have, the latest and greatest enterprise applications built on modern architectures. They may be cloud oriented. They may be, have web interfaces, so on and so forth. But you might be dealing with partners that are working with, PC applications that are, standalone. They might be proprietary applications that they developed 30 years ago, and they're still, mainframe solutions that green screens that just don't really integrate very well with the outside world. And a lot of times you have to, print out information and then manually key it in. Certainly faxes and phone calls are still a very much part of the data and information, process here. So someone has to take that information, and if you want to be able to see it in a visibility solution, someone has to type it in. And that happens a lot these days. So that introduces time and latency into the process. That introduces errors into the process. And again, that's just a reality of what's happening out there. And then it's just, there things happen, things work differently in different geographic regions. I was just talking to someone in Europe, earlier this week, and I was talking about, carrier connectivity and what challenges exist in Europe, and I mentioned how here in the U.S., now you see a lot of carriers that are carrying around, smartphones and kind of the trend that's going on with mobile devices and the ability now to be able to, track your driver and track your truck, via GPS because of these smartphones, and that drivers are able to communicate back to dispatch, via these wireless networks. And he mentioned to me that, the challenge there in Europe is that, unlike here in the United States where it's, one country, and when you go state to state, it doesn't really matter. There, with the wireless plans, for example, I mean, the moment you leave your home country, your home plan, you start getting hit up with very expensive roaming fees, which used to be the reality here, many, many years ago. But because of these roaming fees, because of the way the wireless networks are provided in Europe, they are country specific and so on and so forth, you're seeing less of that over there than you're seeing it here. So again, even though we may be seeing some of these technologies, you can say, okay, well, not that we've overcome some of the hurdles in the past. In the past, let's say in transportation, only those companies that had satellite communications with their trucks had better visibility to the status of their, trucks and visibility to their shipments, so on and so forth. But now, with wireless, we've overcoming that. Well, that might be true, here. That might be true in some other parts, but it's not a universal truth. So it's important to recognize that. Another a challenge, which I think is important to recognize, is that supply chains are continuously getting reconfigured, and they're getting reconfigured at a very rapid pace these days. The reality is that if you take the one extreme, where if back in the days when companies were very very vertically integrated, where they owned every part of the supply chain, from the raw materials and the components all the way through final production. They have visibility to everything. They controlled the different parts of the processes. Maybe they had a single application that they can tap into for visibility. But the reality today is, through outsourcing, through offshoring, through the global environment that we work with, is that companies work with hundreds, if not thousands, of providers. And that's not anything new. That's been happening now for a few decades. I think what is new, relatively new, and this is one of the things that when I talk to executives these days, they cite as part of one of the biggest challenges that they face is the rapid change out there, trying to keep pace with the rapid changes. The reality that their networks are changing much more rapidly these days. They're changing suppliers more often. They are introducing more products into new places, so they can continuously, the companies that they work with, whether they're suppliers, whether they're carriers, whether they're different countries that they have to tap into because they're entering new markets, all of that continues to change, and just trying to keep up, as I mentioned earlier, trying to integrate with those systems and those parties, and other entities. The reality is you may do that today, and a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, you may not be working with that entity anymore, and you're going to be working with a whole host of other entities that you have to kind of repeat that process again. So this goes back to the point I made at the beginning that this is an ongoing process. This is something that it's not you don't do it once and you're done. It's an ongoing challenge. It's an ongoing investment of time and resources and effort to really keep pace and stay connected with a very dynamic supply chain network that you might have. And then finally, the final challenge is something that I've been talking about for a long time is that who owns visibility and data quality management. A lot of times when you talk to a supply chain logistics executive, in operations, they'll say, well, that's IT's problem. I mean, IT's got to do the integration. They've got to figure out how to get the systems to talk to each other, so on and so forth. If you talk to IT, they say, well, that's not our problem. That's operations problem or supplier relationship management. They've got to make sure that their suppliers, the business partners that we work with are keeping their data up to date and accurate. So there's a lot of finger pointing going on, and no one really takes. It's hard to pin down who actually has responsibility and ownership of data quality and visibility. So what's happened and what you see a lot of is a lot of the finger pointing, and it's just easier to kind of be in reactive mode and just deal with the issues, after the fact, than actually taking a more proactive approach and deciding to own the problem, making it a priority. So again, this organizationally, going back to the point I made before, you can put in the software, you can put in the technology, but ultimately it has to, someone has to own it. Someone has to take responsibility for it. Someone has to invest the time and the effort to really, work with suppliers, work with the IT, work with the various parties that all play a role in making sure that data quality, data is timely, accurate, and complete, and not only on a snapshot basis, but on an ongoing basis. And again, and especially as these supply chain networks continue to evolve. So those are my list of kind of the five of the key challenges that I see in terms of why supply chain visibility kind of remains an elusive goal. So the question next is, what can companies do about it? And so I've given some thought to that, and I've got 3 recommendations that I want to share with you today. Again, not a comprehensive list, but I think these are 3 things that I think would help in terms of alleviating the situation, or at least getting you closer to the goal. The first one is map your supply chain. This is you see it all the time when supply chain disruptions occur, whether it's the Japan earthquake or even the Bangladesh disaster, where all of a sudden companies realize that they didn't realize that they were working with a supplier, or that that their supplier subcontracted to somebody else, and so on and so forth. So one of the hardest things to do is really to fully understand your end-to-end supply chain processes and who all the parties are that are involved in that process. And not just the single tier deep, but multiple tiers deep. And again, as you can see, that takes a lot of work. That takes a lot of commitment to do that. And like I mentioned earlier, part of the challenge is that you do that work today, and 6 months from now, a year from now, 2 years from now, your network's going to be completely different. So you have to keep doing that. It's also a smart thing to do from a risk management standpoint. And that's one of my recommendations as well when I talk to companies about risk management. Really the fundamental, the foundation to risk management is really mapping your supply chain, really understanding, all the different process steps involved from point A to point B, and all the different parties that are involved, and where those locations are, so on and so forth. So even from a risk management standpoint, it's a smart thing to do. Some of you might recall a very famous Harvard Business Review article from many years ago, which was staple yourself to an order, and really at the heart of that article is really the recommendation to really take a step to really understand the complete process flow around your business, so that you can, number one, identify where the bottlenecks are. Number two, then be able to identify opportunities, for improvement. And the same thing is true here. Unless you have, a clear understanding of your supply chain network, who's involved and how they're each involved, and then going deeper in terms of understanding their IT capabilities, and then going deeper and then being able to communicate to them and putting processes in place around data quality management. Unless you do that, you're never going to achieve timely, accurate, and complete visibility around your supply chain. The second recommendation, which is tied to that, is the need to tie data quality management to financials and compensation. So I talked about the investments that are required to do this right. Well, the only way you're going to get buy-in from the CEO and the CFO is if you put it in monetary terms. You got to be able to put a cost, a dollar sign around kind of where you're leaving money on the table today because of poor data quality and poor visibility, and what the benefits in dollar terms will be by gaining that visibility, and then contrasting that to the cost and investment that you'll need to make to get there. So unless you do that, it's going to be very difficult to kind of get that buy-in. And again, I think that's why in some cases it's easier to just kind of finger point. It's not my problem. It's my supplier's problem. It's IT's problem. It's somebody else's problems but your own. And then you just deal with the, you just kind of stay in reactive mode. The other thing is to really tie, data quality management to compensation. There's a saying that if you want something to get done, it's got to impact your wallet, right? Unless it impacts your wallet, it's hard to get by it or get people to act. So again, and I know that many companies do this with their suppliers, where receiving information and data quality is part of what's expected of them in order to be able to do business with you as a company. More of that needs to happen. But you also have opportunities to, instead of being punitive, to make it kind of a positive thing. So I know of companies that, for example, they with their transportation carriers, if their carriers provide timely, accurate, and complete data around pickups, around status, around invoicing, so on and so forth, shippers are paying them faster. So there's an incentive there for that partner, in this case a carrier, to really focus on data quality management, making sure that they get that data to that shipper in the format that they want, in the time frame that they want, in as 100% accurate as possible, because the incentive for them is that they're going to get paid faster. And we all know that for transportation carriers, there's nothing more important than cash flow. Whereas for those that don't focus as much on the data quality piece, or have poor data quality, or don't submit their data on time, they'll get paid on standard terms, or over time, they're not going to be doing business with you, right? So I think ultimately you've got to tie in data quality management to compensation, to financial, to the business, your expectations of the companies you work with, in order to elevate that, elevate the importance and the commitment, to do that. And my final point here, my final recommendation, is really to take a look in the mirror and ask yourself the question: are you willing and able to make the investments in time, money, and resources, to manage connectivity and data quality management? Like I mentioned before, this goes beyond, software. Just the connectivity piece to connect the systems, to test them, to make sure that, to follow up with these suppliers and these external business parties to make sure that they are meeting their commitments around, data quality management. I mean, that's a full-time job. And you've got to have systems in place to track and monitor that. You have to have people in place. You have to have processes in place. So are you willing and able to make those investments to do that? My personal opinion is that many companies don't, and they've demonstrated that by not doing it to date. And I really don't think it should be a core competency of a lot of companies, particularly the connectivity piece. Which is part of the reason, if you've been listening to my program over the past year, or reading my writings on the blog over the past few years, is why I'm a big fan of supply chain operating networks. Because they, in many ways, they take ownership. I talked about it earlier. Who takes ownership for this? That's part of their business, right? So if you outsource this piece of it, or part of this, where a third party is responsible for making those connections for as you change carriers, as you change suppliers, as your network gets reconfigured, they're the ones who are taking ownership of and responsibility for getting you onboarded with those suppliers and customers and other third parties as quickly as possible. And again, part of the value proposition of these supply chain operating networks is that they've got thousands and tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands in some cases, of parties already connected there. So they might, some of the new suppliers that you're working with or new carriers that you're working with might already be part of that network. So that kind of minimizes the work effort and the investment that's needed, to get them onboarded and start, bringing that data and that information to you in the format that you need. And again, so part of the responsibility of supply chain operating network is also to maintain data quality on an ongoing basis, right? To have the processes in place to ensure that. And that's what they get paid for, right? So that, the fact that this is at the heart of their business, whereas the heart of your business is to perhaps design new products or innovate around your manufacturing process, so on and so forth. The heart of a supply chain operating network business is really around connectivity, data quality management, and really helping to provide that visibility. Certainly, 3PLs, third-party logistics providers, are ideally suited for this as well. So you can view them as a supply chain operating network as well. One of the big buzz terms you hear these days, not only across the industry as a whole, but particularly around the 3PL industry, is control towers. And that's something that third-party logistics providers are beginning to position, again, putting themselves in that position of ownership, position of responsibility, taking on the challenge of connecting with the various parties that you work with in your supply chain, making sure that they're bringing in the data into their platform, doing the harmonization of the data, following up with any one of your external parties, partners that might not be complying with your data quality standards, so on and so forth. So again, 3PLs have a role here as well, and I think that's part of the big buzz that you see today around control towers, and why there's a lot of excitement there. So I think at the end of the day, you really have to ask yourself this question: are you willing and able to make that investment? And you might be. Okay, I'm not saying that you necessarily have to outsource that function, but you have to recognize that it's not just software. You have to make the investment in time and money and resources. It's not one of these things that you do it once and you're done. It's an ongoing challenge and investment. So that kind of concludes my thought on this topic. I didn't see any questions or comments here today, but certainly if you go to talkinglogistics.com and particularly those of you who might be watching this program on demand, I'll be, you can submit your question or comment there, and I'll be happy to, answer it down the road. So again, thank you very much for joining me today. I appreciate you taking the time to participate, and certainly look forward to seeing you all in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.